Our guests today are Dave Meyers and Rick Reich. Dave is a partner of Troutman Pepper up in Richmond. Rich is a corporate secretary and assistant general counsel of New Jersey Resources in Wall, New Jersey. We're going to talk executive pay disclosure on Brock Romanek today on Zippy Point. I'm feeling old when I think of SayonPay as an oldie but a goodie because I still feel like it's brand new, but it's been around. It's 10 years, 2011. So Rich, how often might you have SayonPay on the ballot? Let's start with the basics.
So at least once every 6 years, companies have to decide how often they want SayonPay vote. The choices are one every year on an annual basis, every 2 years, or every 3 years. The vast majority of companies are now having an annual SayonPay vote. I believe the number's around 90%. And in our case, the board decided early on that, why wouldn't we just go back on an annual basis? It becomes a routine part of our corporate governance. And I think that became the widely accepted frequency. And then, of course, you have to remember, we were literally in one of the first companies that had a SayonPay vote, because we have a September 30th year end. And we had to remember on the 6th year to have that frequency voted upon again by our shareholders. And the shareholders have preferred an annual SayonPay vote as well in our case.
This is Dave. I'll just add, yeah. So Rich has to count a little differently because it was September 30, because as Brock alluded to, 2011 was when almost all companies had their first SayonPay vote, and then 2017 was when they chose the frequency again. And so 2023 proxy season will be the next huge wave. And what I find interesting is that I have seen a few companies that do it every 3 years still, which is shocking to me. Almost all companies do the vote every year, but I have seen a couple that are 3 years, and I haven't wavered from that, even though it's been, over 10 years now since we've been doing this. And but I guess they've been able to get away with it. So
yeah, and there were a handful of companies that were even biennial, so you can choose 1, 2, or 3. Mm-hmm. So Dave, what does SayonPay actually cover? What are shareholders voting upon, binding or not?
Yeah, so it's a non-binding advisory vote. So technically, it doesn't. You're not actually voting. To actually make it doesn't matter what happens with the vote. I mean, it obviously matters in terms of how ISS and Glass Lewis look at you and relations with your shareholders and stuff. But in terms of any actual changes at the company, it's not like you're, if there's a negative vote, then the compensation's gone or something like that. But you're voting on and we'll talk about there's specific language in terms of what you're actually voting on. But it's basically what's disclosed under item 402. So it's a CD&A, the tables, and the narrative disclosures, what you're actually voting on, whether you approve. And again, there is flexibility about it. There's not a specific form of resolution that needs to be done. Most we found, and the SEC provided some guidance, are very similar to what you're voting on. And so it's usually that so it's usually like a resolve that the compensation paid to the NEOs, which is disclosed pursuant to 402 of SK. And then you usually read off the litany, including the CD&A, the comp tables, and the narrative, because you want to make sure that world is what you're voting on. And so, and you want to make sure, like, for example, you're not voting on the pay ratio, things like that, or anything else you put in that's not within that core compensation. So,
so you have to be very clear about the four corners of what the disclosure is in your proxy that
right.
What the proposal is.
Right.
So Rich, can you talk to the possible trend of investors not only voting against a SayonPay, but also voting against specific members of the compensation committee, or maybe all the members of the compensation committee?
Yes. So recently in the 2020 proxy season, CalPERS when they announced their voting results, they had voted against the compensation committee members at every company where they voted against the SayonPay. And I think the thought behind that is, we're going to get the director's attention directly by not supporting them when we think that there's a SayonPay misalignment or executive compensation misalignment. It'll be interesting to see if other companies follow, other investors follow suit. But generally, these trends start with a CalPERS or a little bit more activist-minded institutional investor, and they spread to others. So, and I think this also stems from the fact, as Dave mentioned, it's a non-binding advisory vote, but the investors want to put a little bit more teeth in it. And there are companies that habitually you get a negative vote and sort of shrug their shoulders. There's not many, but there are a few, and I think this is the investors' way of putting some teeth into their vote.
Yeah, I'll just second that. I think the investors have led the teeth because it's a non-binding advisory vote. So in order for there to be actual action by companies, both the investors and then the proxy advisors are the ones who have pushed companies to have to deal with if you're not getting the right vote. Now, unfortunately, as we'll talk about a little later, it's not a pass-fail type of vote. Even with a supermajority vote, you may still have to deal with ISS and Glass Lewis if you want to make sure that your directors or comp committee are getting approved or that they recommend. It's quite a bit of embarrassment if the company doesn't get a positive recommendation from ISS and Glass Lewis. And so we'll talk about that a little later, but that is something where the teeth come in.
So Dave, given that sort of scrutiny, I don't know if we call it heightened scrutiny, but just scrutiny of investors on SayonPay, what sort of description do you need about that? What kind of disclosure in the proxy to get your messaging across to investors?
So you need to have, the proxy rules require that you have a separate vote on it and a brief explanation of the effect of the vote. And you also want to make sure the shareholders understand it's non-binding. What has developed over time is that it's actually a very short, usually about a page disclosure for this, because most companies are putting all their effort obviously into the CDNA. And also now you see a lot of executive summaries, very investor friendly overviews of all the positive things the company's doing. So that's mostly where all the highlights and the rationale of why compensation is paid per performance and all the other things, and a lot of detail there. And so the actual separate section for the vote and resolution and the backup for it is relatively short and to the point. And so really getting to the two or three key things they want people to focus on about the compensation within the vote. And again, most people are not looking really at that. When you get to the vote, they're looking at the vote and they're going to base it on the CDNA and the other things going on and the proxy advisors' recommendations.
And then I just finished actually a separate Vid-Guide about the voting standard section of the proxy. It's about a 40-minute video. Carl Hagberg joins me to talk about some of the practical mechanical things, but it's only a paragraph or two typically in our proxy, yet sometimes people botch it because they're cutting and pasting from last year, or they have different disclosures about the same thing in different parts of the proxy. So look for that Vid-Guide on zippypoint.com. So what about SayonPay? What do you say about SayonPay in this voting standard section of the proxy, Dave?
So the SEC, they didn't specify a voting standard that's required for it. So you have to defer to your state law and your charter documents. So typically you look at the universe is for and against. You have broker non-votes and abstentions. If it's a Delaware company, which obviously is most companies, abstentions will be considered cast, so they'll be considered a negative vote on the SayonPay when you're looking at it. Many of our clients, and broker non-votes will have no effect because it's not a routine matter, so there will be broker non-votes. For many states, for example, Rich's company is in New Jersey, I'm a Virginia lawyer, abstentions are not considered cast under state law. So like broker non-votes, they won't have an effect on the vote, and you'll just look at for votes versus against. And so it just depends. But it is important in Delaware to realize that abstentions are going to have, make it a negative for the company. And as we'll talk about, since you need to get supermajority approval under the proxy advisors, you want to make sure that you're looking at these votes properly.
And then for the proxy card, and I do have a separate Vid-Guide, a 40-minute one on that with Carl Hagberg that gets really 40 minutes on proxy cards and VIFs, voting instruction forms. But, Carl's an inspector of elections, so he gets beyond the language on the proxy card into the nitty-gritty of of that inspector world, although there is a separate Vid-Guide I have with him about inspector of elections. But how do you describe SayonPay on the proxy card in the VIF, Dave?
So the interesting thing, I think, was maybe people were concerned about how do we go about doing this when this first started. And I think some of the folks had to hold an advisory vote and the SEC came out and they gave guidance and gave actually 4 different ways that they would say were acceptable. So most of them, which can be found in the guidance, and most of them, it's basically to approve a non-binding advisory vote on the executive compensation, and advisory approval of executive compensation, something like that. The key thing is not to say hold a vote to approve, because the SEC says saying hold means you're not sure what you're voting on. Are you voting to then have a vote, or are you actually voting on it? And so they clarified that. But there is flexibility in terms of the actual notice part. So the notice can be broader than what you put on the proxy card. It's really the proxy card that they give very specific language that they want you to use. So
yeah, and it's important to say non-binding or advisory to make
yeah. You want to make it clear. You want to make sure people understand it's both advisory and non-binding. So you see that language pretty consistently among most companies.
And then, Rich, what about in the CD&A? What typically is described about SayonPay in that?
So item 402B1 of Regulation SK requires companies to address in the CD&A whether or not or how their compensation policies and the decisions took into account the most recent SayonPay shareholder vote. If you're getting 98% approval, I think your disclosure is going to be a little bit different. You're basically going to say, that we take this as evidence that the shareholders are supportive of our executive compensation program. If you get into a situation where you're getting a lower approval, I think, there's some other things you may want to say. Well, we considered, our 83% vote approval, thinking about, some of the concerns that investors had, probably want to talk about outreach that you did to certain investors that voted no, to find out what their specific concerns are. And I think that's an important thing to address. If you're below, say, now I know Dave alluded to this earlier, I think ISS and Glass Lewis have certain thresholds which are below. If you're below, you need to they give you prescribed disclosure that they want to see. So for example, I believe ISS, if you're below 70%, they want to know about your engagement efforts with your major institutional investors regarding the issues that are contributing to the lower support. They want to know what specific actions the comp committee and the company are taking to address those issues. And then any other, recent compensation actions taken in the context of that vote. Glass Lewis, Steve, I believe 75% is
75 or 80, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Glass Lewis will also ask for specific things. They want to know if you make revisions to your charter documents, any changes that were made also as a result of this negative feedback you're getting from your investors. So, as a general rule, I think on a sliding scale, the lower your approval is, the more you really need to think about talking to your larger shareholders. I mean, in many of our cases, our public companies, there are 3 shareholders in our case, for instance, that own, well over, I'd say 30% of all of the outstanding shares. So it's, if we were getting 65% approval on SayonPay, would, at least those phone calls need to be made to engage and to find out why our investors aren't happy with us. So I think that's where the CD&A disclosure comes in. And again, 99% approval, you're probably going to say a lot less than you have to if you have under 70.
This is Dave. I think what we've seen is, and this is probably driven by just the general nature of investor relations now, there's a lot more proactive discussions, or attempts at least, to discuss things that concern investors, including compensation, that I think, regardless of the vote, I think companies are much more proactive now over the year in trying to make sure that they're having discussions with their major investors. And so you don't want to, it's less likely that you'll be surprised about investors being upset about compensation. However, we still do see surprising ISS or Glass Lewis negative recommendations where you wouldn't expect it, even, and sometimes that's what creates difficulties. But because I think companies are much more proactive now in their discussions, even when they are surprised that they get a negative recommendation when they didn't expect it, they're having these conversations. So it's not. I think at the beginning, the first few years when we saw some clients get negative recommendations, it was much more of a fire drill than maybe it is now. It's still obviously something that has to be dealt with through disclosure and reach out, but there's less of a fire drill because you either know that there's issues or you've been having discussions with your investors over time and know what they're thinking about. And then on top, this year will also obviously be interesting just because of the pandemic and changes that folks are doing and how all the major investors are going to view compensation decisions with the, given the pandemic situation. So it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, just to add to that, being in-house, I recommend checking in frequently with the CFO or the head of IR, whoever's having routine conversations with investors to find out if executive compensation has come up during their routine meetings or if they're just getting incoming inquiries, because I think that'll also tip off all of us if there's an issue, even if we didn't get below a certain threshold that the ISS doesn't like. You could see some weakness, ahead of time and get ahead of that, as Dave said, and be more proactive.
I think of this a little bit like being in school that, if you get a failing grade, obviously you have a problem. But if you get a C and you wanted to get into a really good college, then you're going to try to boost your grade and you have to be concerned about it. And you got to go through the motions. You got to do your homework. You got to reach out to the teacher and get on their good side. I don't know. Maybe I'm making this all up as I go.
I think it's a good analogy.
Anyways,
Yeah.
I should mention I have a separate Vid-Guide with Pat McGurn of ISS to talk about the 2021 proxy season, and we'll cover this topic from ISS's perspective. So look for that.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brock. Rich.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave.